darkness, knowledge emerges.
The checkpoint smelled of burnt promethium and fear sweat, a combination I had learned to recognize as the signature of Imperial mercy. I stood in line with 300 others, maybe more, all of us clutching the tattered documentation that proved we were human, loyal, worthy of continued existence. The papers were more important than water, more important than food. Without them, you were not a refugee, you were a target, an unknown variable, a potential vector for corruption that could be eliminated without ceremony or consequence. My papers were genuine, or as genuine as anything could be on a world that had changed hands 6 times in 4 years, that had been liberated and reconquered and purged and reclaimed, until the very concept of authority had become fluid, negotiable, dependent entirely on which army currently controlled the checkpoint you happened to be standing at. My name was Theron Mechanicus, though names mean less than papers, less than the stamps and seals and signatures that transform a human being into a category, a classification, a determination of usefulness versus expendability. I was born on Meridius Secundus, a manufacturing world of no particular strategic importance until 2 crusade fleets decided simultaneously that it was, in fact, critical to their respective campaigns, essential to their supply lines. A world that could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands, even though the enemy in question was also the Imperium, was also humanity, was also serving the Emperor's will through violence and conquest, and the systematic transformation of living worlds into fuel for the endless war machine. The First Crusade arrived during harvest season, when the agri-complexes in the southern continent were processing the year's crop, when the silos were full and the distribution networks were running smoothly, when everything functioned as it had functioned for generations within the comfortable predictability of imperial routine. They came in battleships that darkened the sky, that blotted out the sun with their mass, their hulls bearing names like Righteous Fury and Emperor's Judgment and other declarations of divine purpose that did nothing to explain why they immediately began bombarding the northern cities, why they deployed troops to secure populations that had never been in danger, why liberation looked identical to invasion when viewed from ground level. The commissars explained it during the first mandatory assembly, their voices amplified through voxcasters that made them sound less human and more like the machine god speaking through flesh interfaces. We were being saved, they said. The previous administration had been infiltrated by traitors, by heretics, by elements whose corruption was so subtle it had gone undetected for decades, but was now obvious to those with proper authority to recognize such things. The purge would be thorough. The cleansing would be complete. Those who cooperated would be rewarded with continued existence. Those who resisted would learn that the Emperor's mercy was reserved for the faithful, and faith was demonstrated through absolute compliance with immediate orders regardless of how those orders contradicted previous commands from previous authorities. I complied. I had no reason not to comply, no investment in the administrative structures being systematically dismantled, no loyalty to governors and bureaucrats whose names I had never known, and whose policies had affected my life only through the usual mechanisms of taxation and conscription. I worked in a textile manufactorum, operating looms that produced uniform cloth, a job that was tedious and mindless and exactly the kind of essential, unglamorous labor that kept the Imperium functioning beneath all the glory and conquest. My compliance was rewarded with a new identification card, a new set of papers that declared me loyal citizen of the reconquered territories, that bore stamps and seals proving I had been evaluated and found acceptable, that guaranteed my safety and right to continued residence, provided I maintained my productivity and avoided behaviors that might suggest divided loyalties. The Second Crusade arrived 8 months later. They came from a different direction, announced themselves as liberators, declared that the previous crusade had been operating under false orders, had been led by commanders whose authority was questionable, had been implementing policies that contradicted the true imperial vision, as understood by those who possessed proper theological and military credentials. The bombardment began immediately, targeting the garrisons and administrative centers the First Crusade had established, treating the newly installed government as enemy occupation, despite the fact that both forces served the same emperor, fought for the same Imperium, used the same prayers and symbols and rhetorical justifications for their violence. caught between two imperial armies, each claiming sole legitimacy, each declaring the other corrupted or misguided or operating under compromised authority. The civilian population learned quickly that survival required not loyalty but adaptability, not faith but pragmatism, not adherence to principle, but moment-to-moment assessment of which power currently controlled your immediate surroundings, and what that power demanded as proof of your worthiness to continue breathing. My identification papers from the First Crusade became death sentences when the Second Crusade took control of our district, became evidence of collaboration, of having accepted false authority, of being complicit in the regime they had come to overthrow. I burned them in a trash fire and joined the queues at the new registration centers, where I filled out new forms, answered new questions, received new papers that bore different stamps and seals, but served identical functions to categorize, to classify, to determine whether I was asset or liability, whether I should be preserved or eliminated. The textile manufactorum was destroyed in the first week of fighting, reduced to rubble by artillery fire that the Second Crusade insisted was precision targeting of military assets, despite the fact that cloth looms presented no tactical threat to anyone. 700 workers died in the collapse, their bodies crushed or burned, or simply disappeared beneath tons of ferrocrete and twisted metal. I survived because I had been late to shift, had been delayed at a checkpoint while guards verified my newly issued papers, had been standing 3 blocks away when the building came down in a thunder of explosions and structural failure. I felt the shockwave, felt the heat, heard the screaming of those who had been on the edges of the blast radius and were trapped but not dead, pinned but still conscious, calling for help that would not come because rescue operations were low priority when the liberators were still consolidating their hold on the district. Without employment, I became refugee rather than resident, became a body in motion rather than a fixed point in the administrative landscape. The Second Crusade established camps for the displaced, vast tent cities that sprawled across the outskirts of the ruined urban centers, that housed tens of thousands in conditions that were temporary in theory but permanent in practice, because reconstruction was always scheduled to begin next month, next season, once the campaign stabilized and resources could be allocated to civilian concerns rather than military necessity. I lived in those camps for 14 months, sleeping on dirt floors under canvas that leaked when it rained, eating rations that were technically sufficient for survival but tasted of chemicals and despair, existing in a liminal state where I was neither dead nor truly alive, neither citizen nor enemy, neither valuable enough to protect nor dangerous enough to eliminate. The checkpoint lines became the rhythm of existence, the structure around which all other activities organized themselves. Food distribution required standing in line for 3 hours, clutching your papers, hoping the supply hadn't run out before you reached the front. Medical care required standing in line for 6 hours, presenting your papers, being evaluated by exhausted orderlies who had seen so much suffering they could no longer distinguish between treatable conditions and terminal cases. Employment registration required standing in line for entire days, your papers examined by bureaucrats whose job was not to find you work but to document your willingness to work, to maintain records that proved the system functioned even when it manifestly did not, even when the only jobs available were burial detail or rubble clearance or other activities that no one would choose voluntarily but that someone had to perform because the dead needed disposing and the ruins needed organizing. I learned to read papers the way hunters read tracks, the way sailors read weather, the quality of the parchment, the consistency of the ink, the style of the stamps. These details revealed which authority had issued the document, when it had been issued, how long it might remain valid before the inevitable change in administration rendered it obsolete or incriminating. I learned to forge papers when necessary, to adjust dates, to add stamps obtained through barter or theft, to transform documents that said one thing into documents that said something more convenient. This was not heresy, but survival, not corruption, but adaptation to circumstances where the rules changed faster than anyone could track, where yesterday's law became today's capital crime without warning or explanation. The Third Crusade, not truly a Third Crusade, but a splinter faction of the Second that had disagreed about strategic priorities and declared independence from the main force, arrived during the rainy season. They announced themselves as the true inheritors of the reconquest, as forces loyal to the original vision before it had been corrupted by commanders whose faith had wavered, whose conviction had been compromised, whose authority was therefore void. They did not bombardment the city. They infiltrated it, cell by cell, district by district, recruiting from among the garrison troops, converting officers, spreading propaganda that promised stability, order, a return to proper imperial governance once the pretenders were eliminated and legitimate authority restored. The camp where I lived became contested territory, claimed by 3 different factions simultaneously, each conducting patrols, each demanding papers, each insisting that only their stamps and seals were valid, and all others were forgeries or evidence of collaboration with false governments. We learned to carry multiple sets of papers, to keep them hidden in different locations, to produce whichever version corresponded to whichever uniform stood before us demanding documentation. We learned to recognize insignia at distance, to distinguish between forces that looked identical to outsiders, but whose minor variations in heraldry meant the difference between being waved through a checkpoint and being detained for interrogation that might last hours or days or forever. The interrogations were the worst part, worse than the hunger, worse than the cold, worse than watching people you knew disappear and learning not to ask what happened to them. They took place in requisitioned buildings, in basements and back rooms, conducted by soldiers who were trained not in investigation but in extraction, not in determining truth, but in obtaining confirmation of predetermined conclusions. They asked questions that had no correct answers, that were designed to trap you regardless of response, that revealed less about your loyalties and more about the paranoia levels of whichever faction currently controlled the interrogation facility. They asked about neighbors, about relatives, about conversations you might have overheard, about whether you had noticed anything suspicious, anything unusual, anything that might indicate divided loyalties or hidden sympathies, or the kind of ambiguous behaviors that could be interpreted as collaboration with whichever faction they currently defined as the enemy. I was interrogated 7 times across 2 years. Twice by the First Crusades forces before they were driven out, 3 times by the Second Crusades loyalists, once by the Splinter faction, once by what claimed to be an inquisitorial agent but was probably just a commissar with delusions of authority. Each session followed similar patterns: hours of questions, threats of consequences, demands for information I did not possess, accusations based on evidence that was never presented, the constant implication that confession was the only path to mercy, even when no one could articulate exactly what I was supposed to confess to. I survived by giving them nothing, by maintaining absolute consistency in my answers, by refusing to speculate or guess or volunteer information beyond what was directly asked, by understanding that interrogators were less interested in truth and more interested in compliance, in breaking down resistance, in demonstrating that they had power and I had none. Between interrogations, life in the camps continued with the grinding monotony of institutional survival. We woke at dawn to the sound of vox speakers broadcasting prayers and propaganda. We stood in lines for rations. We performed whatever labor had been assigned, digging latrines, clearing rubble, sorting salvage into categories that made sense only to the bureaucrats who maintained the inventory systems. We traded information about which checkpoints were passable, which papers were currently valid, which rumors about the war's progress were reliable, and which were wishful thinking. We died, sometimes from disease, sometimes from violence, sometimes from simple exhaustion, and we buried the dead in mass graves outside the camp perimeter where the soil was already full of bodies from previous rounds of conflict. The siege began in the 3rd year, when a 4th faction, or perhaps a reunified Second Crusade, the distinctions had become impossible to track, surrounded the city and cut off all supply lines, declaring that they would starve out the traitors who had seized control, that they would reduce the urban center to submission through blockade rather than direct assault, that this approach was more merciful because it minimized collateral damage, even though starving a city killed more civilians than bombardment ever did, but did it slowly enough that the deaths could be attributed to natural causes rather than military action. The rations decreased first to half portions, then quarter portions, then disappeared entirely as the stockpiles were exhausted and no resupply convoys broke through the encirclement. The camp administrators, following protocols designed for temporary disruptions rather than prolonged siege, distributed what remained equitably at first, then began prioritizing essential workers, then began hoarding supplies for themselves and their favorites, while the general population starved in tents and hovels. I survived by stealing, by scavenging, by eating things that were not technically food, but contained enough calories to delay death rats, insects, the leather from abandoned boots, the glue from broken furniture. I survived by becoming someone I did not recognize, someone who would steal from the weak, who would trade information for scraps, who would betray others to protect myself, who had shed every moral principle except the imperative to continue existing because death felt like surrender, and I was too stubborn, or too stupid, or too traumatized to surrender, even when surrender was clearly the more merciful option. The cannibalism started in the 4th month of siege, quietly at first, bodies disappearing from the mass graves, rumors circulating about what was being traded in the black markets that operated in the camp's darkest corners. Then, openly, unapologetically, as the desperate stopped pretending they had other options, as hunger transformed humans into animals, as the thin veneer of civilization cracked and revealed the brutal calculus underneath that meat was meat, that the dead did not need their flesh, that survival justified anything because the alternative was joining the dead and becoming meat yourself. I did not participate, or rather, I did not participate knowingly. The mystery stews and unidentified proteins that were occasionally available for barter might have been anything, might have contained anything, and I learned not to ask questions because knowing was worse than uncertainty, because maintaining the fiction of innocence was the only way to maintain sanity in circumstances where sanity was a luxury no one could afford. The siege broke after 7 months, not through relief forces but through collapse, the besiegers finally assaulting the city in a 3-day storm of violence that killed thousands, that reduced entire districts to rubble, that burned warehouses and hab blocks and hospitals without discrimination because everything was potential enemy stronghold. Everything was legitimate target. Everything was acceptable collateral damage in service of the greater strategic objective. The camp where I had lived for 2 years was overrun on the 2nd day, its inhabitants scattered, some killed in the fighting, some captured and processed through the new administration's registration systems, some simply disappearing into the chaos of urban warfare, where individual lives became statistical noise in casualty reports that measured death in percentages rather than names. I fled into the ruins, joining the thousands of other refugees who had learned that survival meant constant movement, meant never staying in one place long enough for any authority to track you, meant existing in the gaps between administrative systems, in the blind spots where the Imperium's vast bureaucratic machinery lost track of individual humans and forgot they existed. I learned to live in basements and sewers, in collapsed buildings and burned-out manufactorums, in spaces that were too damaged to interest salvage teams, but still provided shelter from the elements and concealment from patrols. I learned to scavenge in the dead zones, in the sectors that had been so thoroughly destroyed that even the armies had abandoned them, where corpses lay unburied and unexploded ordnance made every step potentially fatal, but where food and equipment could sometimes be found on bodies that had been picked over by others, but not completely stripped. I learned that there were others living in the ruins, entire communities of refugees and deserters and criminals who had rejected or been rejected by every faction, who had chosen the dangers of the wasteland over the certainties of the camps, who survived through scavenging and raiding and a brutal code of mutual aid that was less noble than pragmatic. You helped others because you might need their help tomorrow, because isolation meant death, because in the ruins you needed eyes you could trust to watch your back even if you could not trust them with anything else. We formed loose packs, groups of 5 or 10 who moved together, who shared information about patrol routes and water sources and buildings that were stable enough to sleep in without risk of collapse. We had no names, or used only nicknames, or changed names weekly because names were anchors, were ways to track us, were vulnerabilities in environments where vulnerability meant exploitation. The patrols came through irregularly. Sweep and clear operations meant to root out resistance cells and criminal elements, meant to reassert control over districts that had been written off as lost, meant to demonstrate that the Imperium's reach extended even into the ruins, even though the Imperium's ability to actually govern those ruins was essentially zero. We learned to recognize the signs of approaching patrols, the distant growl of engines, the chatter of Vox traffic, the sour chemical smell of soldiers who wore armor that recycled their body waste imperfectly. We learned to hide, to scatter, to become invisible in the rubble that looked uniform to outsiders but was mapped in our minds with the precision of hunters who knew every shadow and bolt hole, who could disappear in seconds and remain concealed for hours while soldiers walked past meters away, who survived not through fighting but through the absolute commitment to non-engagement, because engaging meant being identified and identified meant being eliminated. I lost count of how many times I hid while patrols searched the ruins, how many times I lay motionless in a drainage pipe or beneath a collapsed wall while boots crunched through debris overhead, while voices shouted questions at shadows, while weapons discharged at movement that was probably rats but might have been insurgents. I lost count of how many bodies I found in the aftermath. Refugees who had been too slow or too visible or too unlucky, who had been executed on suspicion of being enemy combatants, despite being unarmed civilians, whose only crime was existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. I stopped counting because counting meant keeping track, meant maintaining connection to a world where numbers mattered, where individual deaths could be tallied and mourned, where loss had meaning beyond the simple arithmetic of, there were 5 of us this morning and now there are 4. The sickness came with the seasonal rains, cholera or typhus or some other disease, with a medical name that no one in the ruins knew or cared about, because the symptoms were identical regardless of technical classification. Fever, diarrhea, dehydration, death within days for those who were weak or young or old, death within weeks for those who were strong enough to fight but not strong enough to win. We lost half the pack in the first month, lost them to convulsions and organ failure, lost them to the simple fact that bodies need water, and clean water was impossibly rare in ruins where every source was contaminated by corpses and chemical runoff and the accumulated waste of years of warfare. I survived by staying mobile, by refusing to drink from any source until I had watched others drink first and waited to see if they died, by treating every mouthful of water as potential poison that I consumed only because the alternative of dehydration was more certain than the risk of infection. The recruiters came in the second year of living in the ruins, agents from some faction or another, I never determined which, because the insignia they wore matched no force I had encountered previously, offering salvation through service, offering food and shelter and papers in exchange for enlistment, offering the chance to become predator rather than prey, to be the one conducting patrols rather than hiding from them, to reclaim some measure of dignity and purpose, even if that purpose was violence, even if that dignity was built on participation in the same systems that had destroyed everything I had known. Some accepted. The hunger was too much, the exhaustion too complete, the psychological weight of being hunted too crushing to sustain indefinitely. They took the uniforms and weapons, went through whatever abbreviated training the recruiters provided, and disappeared into the war machine that consumed soldiers as efficiently as it consumed civilians, that processed humans into casualties regardless of which side of the line they stood on. I refused. Not from principle. I had no principles left, had burned them for warmth in the cold months, had traded them for food in the hungry months, had discarded them as excess weight that could not be carried when running from patrols. I refused because I understood with the clarity of someone who had survived too much that joining meant becoming target from a different angle, meant exchanging the dangers of being prey for the certainties of being weapon, meant transforming from someone the war happened to into someone the war happened through. And I was tired, was exhausted beyond physical fatigue into the kind of soul-deep weariness that made continuing feel impossible but stopping feel like betrayal of everyone who had already died, who had not had the chance to refuse, who had been consumed by the war without ever being offered choice. The checkpoint where this confession began, where I stand now, where I have stood for 3 hours, where I will stand for 3 more, until my papers are examined and my status determined, is operated by a force I do not recognize, whose insignia combines elements from multiple previous administrations in ways that suggest either reunification or splintering so extreme that coherence has dissolved into territorial gang warfare with imperial aesthetics. The guards are young, younger than I am despite the decades I have lost track of, young enough that they might have been children when the first crusade arrived, Young enough that this war is the only context they have ever known. Young enough that they probably believe the propaganda about glory and duty and the sacred obligation to purge the unworthy. I clutch my papers, the 7th or 8th or 15th set I have obtained, I have lost count, papers that declare me loyal refugee seeking resettlement, papers that bear stamps and seals from authorities that might still exist or might have been destroyed months ago, papers that are simultaneously genuine and fraudulent because the entire concept of legitimacy has been rendered meaningless by years of competing claims to authority. I rehearse my story, the simplified version that omits everything that might be interpreted as collaboration or resistance, that presents me as passive victim rather than active survivor, that transforms my years of adaptation and compromise and moral flexibility into a narrative of suffering and faithfulness that might convince these guards I deserve whatever mercy they are authorized to dispense. The line moves forward. People ahead of me are processed, some waved through, some taken aside for additional questioning, some simply shot in the head when their papers prove unacceptable and the guards decide summary execution is more efficient than detention. I watch each death with the numbed detachment of someone who has seen too many deaths to react emotionally, who has learned that grief is luxury and horror is background noise, who has reduced all human experience to the binary of continue existing or cease existing because anything more complex requires cognitive resources I no longer possess. When I reach the checkpoint, when the guard examines my papers with eyes that are already bored, already convinced that everyone in this line is the same regardless of what their documentation claims, I will answer whatever questions are asked with the mechanical precision of someone who has answered these questions hundreds of times, who knows exactly what responses are acceptable and what responses trigger additional scrutiny. I will present myself as grateful supplicant, as loyal subject, as someone who has suffered but remained faithful, as someone who deserves mercy not because of any inherent worth, but because the alternative of eliminating me would be inefficient, would be wasted ammunition, would be administratively inconvenient, and maybe I will be waved through, will be given new papers, will be processed into whatever system this particular administration has established for managing the displaced and desperate. Maybe I will find work, will find shelter, will find some temporary stability before the next change in command renders my papers invalid and transforms me once again from asset into liability. Or maybe the guard will see something in my face that suggests I am more complicated than my papers indicate, will send me for interrogation, will initiate a process that will end in detention or execution or transformation into servitor, or whatever fate the Imperium reserves for those who survive when they were supposed to die, who adapt when they were supposed to remain rigid, who persist when they were supposed to disappear. Either outcome is acceptable. Both outcomes are the same. I am trapped not by these armies but by the fact of having survived them, by carrying memories that make returning to normal life impossible even if normal life still existed somewhere, by knowing truths about the Imperium that cannot be unlearned, that authority is fiction, that legitimacy is performance, that the vast machinery of imperial governance is actually competing fiefdoms held together by force and propaganda, and the shared commitment to never admitting that the emperor's vision has fragmented into 1,000 contradictory interpretations, each claiming sole authenticity. I am trapped between crusades that will never end, because ending would require someone admitting they were wrong, would require compromise that the Imperium's theological framework makes impossible, would require recognizing that perhaps the enemy was never external but was always this, was always the grinding logic of a system that measures success in conquest and values territory over the people who inhabit it, that treats civilian populations as obstacles or resources, but never as the purpose of governance, never as the reason that authority should exist at all. The guard is calling my name, or the name on my papers, which may or may not be my actual name anymore. I step forward, extending the documents, preparing the story, activating the performance I have perfected over years of checkpoints and interrogations. I am loyal, I am faithful, I am grateful for the Emperor's mercy. I am whatever they need me to be to let me pass, to let me continue, to let me survive another day in the eternal present of being refugee, being displaced, being trapped in the space between competing certainties that cannot coexist but cannot eliminate each other, that grind against each other with friction that generates nothing but heat and noise, and the bodies of those caught between. This is my confession. This is my testimony. This is the story of life between the Crusades, where faith becomes transaction, where loyalty becomes performance, where survival becomes the only principle that matters, because all other principles are weapons used to justify your elimination. I do not expect mercy. I do not expect justice. I expect only continuation or cessation, expect only the next checkpoint or the bullet, expect only the grinding forward momentum of a war that has no strategic objective beyond its own perpetuation, that exists because it exists, that continues because stopping would require admitting it should never have started. The guard is reading my papers. His expression is skeptical. He calls over a supervisor. They confer quietly, glancing at me, at my documents, at each other. They are deciding something. They are determining my fate through processes I cannot influence, through criteria I cannot predict, through the arbitrary exercise of power that defines every interaction between imperial authority and imperial subject. I wait. I have become very good at waiting. I have had years of practice. The decision, when it comes, will be absolute. There is no appeal, no second chance, no path forward except the one they designate. I will accept it because acceptance is the only option, because resistance is suicide, because I have survived too long through compliance to suddenly develop principles about which I die. This is what it means to be refugee between crusades. This is what it means to be trapped between competing certainties. This is what it means to survive in the Imperium when the Imperium cannot decide what it is, cannot maintain consistency, cannot offer any guarantee except that everything will change and nothing will improve. The guard is stamping my papers. He is waving me through. I have survived this checkpoint. There will be others. There are always others. The line continues forever, loops back on itself, stretches into a future that looks exactly like the past except populated by different corpses, different authorities, different papers that mean the same nothing. I pick up my documents, I move forward, I continue. Because continuing is all that remains when everything else has been taken, has been destroyed, has been transformed into fuel for wars that serve no one except those who wage them, who profit from them, who need them to continue, because ending would reveal that nothing was accomplished, nothing was gained, nothing was worth the cost, except the careers of commanders and the pride of factions and the theological abstractions that sound profound in prayers but mean nothing to those dying in ruins. I am Mechanicus, or whoever I have become in the years since that name meant something. I am refugee, I am survivor, I am trapped, and I will continue being trapped until death provides the only exit from this eternal war between powers that claim my loyalty, while offering nothing except the opportunity to serve their violence until I am consumed by it. This is my life. This is my confession. This is the price of surviving when survival itself has become the enemy, when continuing means participating, when existence means complicity, when there is no innocent position available, and the only choice is which side of the murder you stand, on the side that kills, or the side that dies, or the narrow space between where you wait for the decision to be made for you. The checkpoint recedes behind me, another waits ahead, the line never ends, the war never ends. And I, trapped between them, can only continue forward into whatever comes next, carrying papers that are already obsolete, wearing identity that is already fiction, maintaining the performance of being human when humanity has been revealed as costume we wear while serving as components in machinery that cares nothing for what we were and everything for what we can be transformed into. I am tired. I am so tired. But I cannot stop. Stopping means dying. And dying means surrendering to the system that I have spent years resisting through the simple act of continuing to exist despite every indication that I should not, that I was not meant to, that my survival is error the Imperium will eventually correct. Until then, I walk, I wait, I present my papers, I perform my loyalty, I continue. Because there is nothing else. There has never been anything else. And there never will be.